Our coronavirus reality could last until July or August, President Trump admitted at a news conference, but it was also announced that a new vaccine human trial had just begun, likely the fastest in history, and all because scientists finally got it. Animal tests aren't just unnecessary, they get in the way of real progress. The race to the virus vaccine, aided by skipping much of traditional animal tests. Next on the PETA Podcast. Welcome to the PETA Podcast. I'm Emil Guillermo, your host for this behind-the-scenes look at PETA, the largest animal rights organization in the world. And on today's episode, you may be like the majority of Americans in some form of self-quarantine or lockdown. It is the best and most effective way to stop the coronavirus, aka COVID-19, according to Dr. Anthony Fauci. You just have to think about it in a new way.
When you're dealing with an emerging infectious diseases outbreak, you are always behind where you think you are if you think that today reflects where you really are.
Fauci, the head of the National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Diseases at the National Institutes of Health, put into perspective how information lags, especially when it comes to the coronavirus, at a White House news conference.
It will always seem that the best way to address it would to be doing something that looks like it might be an overreaction. It isn't an overreaction. It's a reaction that we feel is commensurate, which is actually going on in reality.
So it's not an overreaction. It's breaking from the norm, like keeping social distance, staying home, aggressively washing your hands, not touching your face, refraining from gatherings of more than 10. In every aspect in fighting the virus, you have to think about it in a new, bold way, including the race to find a vaccine. They're skipping the long-required animal testing. And that's where Fauci revealed how history was being made.
The vaccine candidate that was given the first injections for the first person took place today. You might recall when we first started, I said it would be 2 to 3 months. And if we did that, that would be the fastest we've ever gone from obtaining the sequence to being able to do a phase 1 trial. This has been now 65 days, which I believe is the record. What it is, it's a trial of 45 normal individuals between the ages of 18 and 55. The trial is taking place in Seattle. There will be 2 injections, one at 0 day, first one, then 28 days. There will be 3 separate doses, 25 milligrams, 100 milligrams, 250 milligrams, and the individuals will be followed for 1 year, both for safety and whether it induces the kind of response that we predict would be protective. And that's exactly what I've been telling this group over and over again. So it's happened. The first injection was today.
The fastest, only because cruel and ineffective animal tests once required now were seen as unnecessarily delaying the race to get to a coronavirus vaccine. PETA has been in the forefront for more than 20 years to get the scientific community to end regulatory animal testing. Listen to PETA Podcast number 85 to get the background. Fauci's pronouncement indicated at the highest level a recognition of the benefits of ending animal tests. I talked with Jeffrey Brown, a biologics specialist with the PETA Regulatory Testing Department, about the first coronavirus vaccine test in the U.S., which skipped traditional animal testing and became one of the fastest ever to human trials. My conversation with PETA's Jeff Brown on the PETA Podcast.
It's without a doubt the fastest I've ever heard. And my thoughts are, thank heavens. This is a situation where my background is in public health. I went to graduate school for epidemiology. That's just exactly what's going on right now. Epidemiology is the study of how diseases move around in populations. And for an epidemiologist, I think the usual reticence that we have when going into a situation like this, where an outbreak has happened and it's spreading very quickly, is that we can learn a lot about, in this case, the virus that's causing this illness. But we know that the usual status quo approach to developing a vaccine for a specific illness takes a very long time. It can take at least a year, year and a half in the best circumstances. Oftentimes it takes much longer than that. So it does take extraordinary circumstances. And I think the simplest way to put it is that the first priority in a situation like this for public health officials like Dr. Fauci is mitigating a health crisis. What we're seeing now with this new approach, this very rapid approach, is that what the officials in the government are saying is that the status quo of using animals' bodies as a gatekeeper for how we develop new and essential medicines is not a first priority.
And so what kind of bells should that ring in all the minds of animal rights activists and animal lovers everywhere in the world?
I think many times we're in a position where when business is moving as usual, when there is no, let's say, urgent or crisis type event that's motivating people to think about how we do business, how we develop drugs, how we test them. We all know that the process is very slow. And I mean, we sort of famously are well aware and have been aware for decades that the process that we use to develop new drugs, which under a system of laws and regulations says that if you want to get a drug onto the market that people can take, you must, by law, run those new drugs through many different species of non-human animals before it ever encounters a human body. And the sad effects of the system that we've built up over decades is that time and time again, the industries involved in this kind of therapy develop drugs that very successfully treat illnesses in non-human animal species. And then the first time they encounter human bodies, when they first get to clinical trials, they fail. And they don't just fail occasionally. This is 95% of the time drugs that are safe and effective in non-human animals. As soon as they get into human bodies, they fail because they don't do what they say they do on the label, or that they cause side effects that make the treatment unacceptable. So with a system like this is absolutely the establishment saying, it's sort of like, don't look behind the curtain too much, because right now the urgency is there. It is so urgent for us to have an effective vaccine that can prevent transmission of coronavirus that all of those other rules are suddenly very visibly seen as flexible. And it's much more important to make sure that drugs that companies are developing that might work as vaccines against the coronavirus, it's essential to know at stage 1, do these work in humans? Do these cause side effects in humans? And it tells us that with the right kind of planning and the right kind of technologies and the science that goes into this, that no, we don't necessarily need this very deeply entrenched system of running all of these drugs through every kind of test you can imagine in non-human animals.
All right, but what this means is we've actually, because of the urgency of the coronavirus, we've exploded through a brick wall, right? We've said, we skipped the line. And by skipping the line, we have spared millions, and I don't think I'm overstating it, but we've spared potentially millions in all animal tests, right? A needless, wasteful animal testing, right?
Yeah, you're absolutely right. I don't think you're understating it at all. Getting any new drug to market that's intended for humans, absolutely, the numbers of animals gets into the millions. And in situations like this, to be frank, we know that in this specific case, the National Institutes of Health is funding this clinical trial. And a clinical trial is just, that language just means the first time that humans are getting the drug. And otherwise, we would call all the experiments that are conducted using animals, those are called preclinical trials, right? So in this case, instead of having the preclinical trials that use all these animals happen before it ever comes to a human, some of these preclinical tests in animals, they're happening alongside the tests in humans. And that's to say, even if some questionable results come up from animal tests, if the clinical trial in humans works very well, that information is going to make much more of an impact in the medical field right now. People would be able to say, well, it looks like these people who received this first coronavirus vaccine tolerate it well, and maybe in a couple of months we can see that some of these people have been exposed to the virus and they don't get sick. That means much more than if at the same time an experiment where rats or dogs or guinea pigs are given the same vaccine, if they have problems or if they aren't protected from the virus, then it's much easier for the medical community and the government agencies that have to make these decisions to say, well, okay, that's information, but it's working in people. So like you say, this is sidestepping the status quo in a way that is going to help us talk about in the future how we conduct similar clinical trials.
All right, but we've got a route for this virus, for this trial to work, because if it does work, it essentially means that all those, and we've saved millions of lives, and we have maybe created a new path that might make it more normal to go straight to humans and skipping and saving and sparing all the animals who have died needlessly in animal tests, right?
Of course, this is a watershed moment. I mean, when push comes to shove, the urgency associated with this situation does mean that, like the agencies like the Food and Drug Administration have done before, in specific circumstances, it's okay. It's even preferable to try new approaches, because if the old approach comes with the price tag of taking a very long time, and time is what is important, then that's an acceptable risk to take.
All right, but the urgency, I mean, it's almost like the idea of the perfect storm, right? The urgency, the magnitude. Could this begin this new path toward let's go straight to human trials as opposed to the animals?
Of course. And I think specifically in this case, the company in question that's developed this first coronavirus vaccine, they're named Moderna. The method that they're using to make this vaccine, it's not necessarily a new approach. They're kind of following a recipe that's been used for other vaccines. And so we know that this recipe, generally speaking, is a good approach. And what they're doing now is saying, we know this approach well enough. We understand that in the past, maybe government agencies were really risk averse with good reason, and they wanted a lot of assurances that this would be safe. But now we know that this approach is safe. And this wouldn't be getting to human clinical trials right now if the NIH didn't think it was safe, if the FDA didn't think it was safe. So you do this once, even if it's under very harsh circumstances, then the effect that happens after we see the data that comes from these studies in humans is undeniable. And it absolutely will lead to a much larger discussion in the field of companies that develop these drugs and the governments that oversee them as to how essential is it to run these studies in animals before humans can be involved.
So the cracks really were there already, but the emergency of the coronavirus may have widened it. And if it's successful, how close do you think we will be to ending animal testing in regulatory situations? How soon can we get to just an end of the use of animals for regulatory testing if this thing works?
It certainly speeds the plow. I think vaccines are a very special group of drugs. For many kinds of vaccines, there are so many different ways of making vaccines, but we know them quite well now. We've known them quite well for a very long time. And this is one of those areas where the timeline looking forward to the end of having to have all of these animal tests before people can try taking these drugs in clinical trials is much shorter. 10 years, 5 years, it's close. And I say this because we've known for a very long time in this industry that the way that we develop vaccines is very species specific, much more so than all sorts of other drugs. And the example that I tend to lean on is we think about HIV vaccines. You know, HIV is the virus that causes AIDS. Dozens of vaccines have been developed over the last 2 decades that very effectively prevent non-human species from contracting this virus. Not a single one of them has ever succeeded in humans. And the cost that's involved in that, aside from the animals who suffer in those experiments, is tremendous. And the industries that develop these vaccines are acutely aware. They really know that what we're doing is developing frontline drugs that are mostly aimed at passing these tests, these preclinical tests in non-human animals that have nothing to do with how the humans who will ultimately end up receiving these drugs will respond.
So we are potentially ending a period of wastefulness in terms of money, in terms of animals' lives, and getting maybe a faster track to the answers that we need. Given that, if this is successful in Seattle with the, this test, this human trial, how close do you think we are to developing a vaccine that will work for coronavirus?
Well, the simplest answer to that is that this one trial that's happening in Seattle is far from the only one. There are many companies who are working on this, and a lot of companies that work in this space have retooled what they're doing to try to come to address this as a really specific, like the most pressing challenge in public health right now. So even if this group in Seattle doesn't succeed, there are many others. Someone is going to crack this, and someone is going to crack it fairly quickly. So the goal is to have a vaccine out in less than a year, and someone will reach it. And if we can get there in less than a year, if we can get there in half a year even, it remains to be seen how success in these clinical studies will translate into getting governments to actually admit that these drugs are safe and effective to use in people. So there are still some unknowns, but no matter how you cut this, someone is going to make these very groundbreaking discoveries in the next few months that show from the get-go that we can flip this model on its head. We can use these tried and true methods of developing vaccines that are safe and effective in humans, and we can start using those very well-established methods, show that they're safe in humans, and go ahead and start manufacturing these drugs. That's not to say that these companies and government agencies won't require for some time that the traditional animal studies be done alongside these trials in humans, or even after they're already approved for use in humans. But the end is in sight, and it remains on it's on the plate for government agencies right now to make this call. So it can be as successful as soon as possible, as long as government agencies are comfortable and willing to say that modern science is better than leaning on the status quo that we've really relied on for decades without critically looking at how we do drug development.
But the only way we've been able to get the speed, the only way we've been able to get there in the fastest way possible, like maybe developing a vaccine within a year's time, is if we skip the line. And that means skipping testing on animals, period, right?
Yeah, that's absolutely correct. And I think an interesting quandary that comes up when you say this is that I have no problem saying to you point blank, this is absolutely true. We know that skipping the line, so to speak, is how our health industries can be very quickly responsive to emerging infectious disease threats. So people in the sciences acknowledge this as well, but it's a very taboo subject. It's hard for people who work for big drug companies to openly discuss. It's difficult to get this public discussion open in a way that if you're talking to someone who is a scientist who works for PETA, we're very comfortable being frank about this and saying what's on the minds of people who are in the field. That doesn't mean that there aren't still hurdles, but you're absolutely right. The only way that we can speed up this process is to cut out this very long and laborious and animal intensive process that eats up time and takes us away from that initial goal of how do you mitigate a health crisis as a first priority. We're doing that now, and these companies are really changing the game by coming to these agencies and saying, we know a way to do this, and you need to listen to us.
Well, tell me, it's not just the urgency. There must be some kind of sea change or maybe a generational change. What has changed the addiction that the research community has on killing animals in testing? What is it that, I mean, it's good that they've been supercharged by the coronavirus and everyone wants to get there first. So they realize the only way they can get there first is by skipping the animal testing. But is there anything else that is it a generational change? Is it a younger scientists, newer scientists saying, hey, we could do this in a better way? What do you think is changing this addiction to animals and testing on animals that the research community has?
Yeah, without a doubt, that's a component. I mean, people like myself, I come from a laboratory research background, and I've been working for PETA for more than a decade. We encounter people all the time who work in the research field who have a different kind of exposure to information about how the status quo has been for a long time and what its failures are. So there's no doubt, every conference that we go to, every meeting that we attend, when we present on the work that we do to take animals out of the equations for not just vaccine development, but drug development, pesticide development, on and on. We know that this is there's sort of a like you said, a sea change that's been happening. Governments have acknowledged this too. This isn't just an activist or an advocate position. Government agencies have come out in the last decade and a half to say the future of science is not based in animal biology. It's based in human relevant biology. And in that time, a lot of money has opened up for young career scientists and even big companies that have an interest in the cutting edge to know that the way that you streamline the process of developing drugs isn't to just lean back on the way science has been done in the past, but to lean forward and pay attention to how innovation is paving the way for how modern methods, like what's been used to develop this initial corona vaccine, the promise that they hold for being able to target exactly what we need and being able to cut out all the extra work. And a lot of that extra work, if not most of that extra work, is relying on these old-fashioned animal toxicology tests.
Well, if you look at it and you see, well, where's the dead weight? No pun intended there, but animals have been killed in these tests, and they've really done nothing to advance any new drugs necessarily in terms of that's what the you said 95% of these drugs, after they go from animal model success, they fail in human tests. So what is so we know that the science, they have the records that show where they should go. How about the public pressure? If the public knows or begins to understand what's going on, does public pressure? I mean, now we have people who are fearful of the virus. That's got to be public pressure to speed the plow, as you say. How much more can public pressure help to end animal testing?
It's honestly, it's everything. And when public pressure is an interesting phrase because everyone, I think, is allowed an opinion on the process that science in general, that the industries and governments use to develop drugs, because we all take these medicines. And in times of crisis, it certainly brings into focus people's urgencies about what they need and what they want. And in situations like this, I think it's interesting because the clinical trial that's being conducted now for this coronavirus vaccine, it's the people who've been recruited into this clinical trial, they're not forced into it. These are volunteers. So people tend to step forward when a company or a group of researchers says, "Look, people, this is what we would like to do in the best possible circumstances. We think we can make this drug, and here's all the evidence that says this is exactly why we think we can do this." Science isn't just imagining that using animals is a stumbling block, they're able to point to the evidence that says we're stumbling on this. And if we can do this in a better way by cutting out some of the animals, are you interested? And people absolutely say yes. And at the same time, this isn't just limited to vaccines. There are companies that have really been pushing back to the Food and Drug Administration and other regulators that approve drugs for the market, where specific situations arise where companies say, we have all the information we need already. We don't need to keep conducting new animal tests. You're not going to get any more confidence in the safety or effectiveness of a drug from more animal tests. One company, Vanda Pharmaceuticals, has just in the last year taken the Food and Drug Administration to court to say, FDA, you're putting too many burdens on us. You're telling us to do more tests in animals when we have data that says this drug is safe in humans. It does what it needs to do in humans. It's what you're asking us to do by running this through more tests isn't going to do anything to improve the safety or the effectiveness of the drug in humans. So, like, this sea change metaphor comes up time and time again. The industries have long recognized that the way we do business now is slow, it's expensive, and it really doesn't get good drugs onto the market. And so everybody is paying attention to companies that are getting out there in front of these problems and saying, you know what, we're not going to sit on the sidelines right now. We're going to come to the FDA. We're going to come to these government agencies and say, we know how to do this very well, and you need to listen. And that's what's happening right now.
Now, as a scientist who has been part of the industry and now you're working for PETA, how gratifying is it to see this, that you are, you're seeing that maybe the whole industry is, as you put it, turning the model on its head. And maybe we could, is this historic to see this test for the coronavirus in Seattle? Could it lead to a real historic change?
Historic, I think, is a very mild word for it. This is a turning point. And I think many times turning points in our history do come about in times of crisis. So it can be, in normal circumstances, it can be difficult to maybe take a step that feels like you're stepping out of the comfort of the way that business has been done for a long time, even if you know that the way business has been done for a long time isn't very good. So this extra motivation now that we have of people paying very close attention to how this coronavirus is spreading and how much anxiety the general public has about it means that many more eyes and ears are listening to the news and looking up questions on the internet and coming to PETA, coming to drug companies to ask, why is this just now being talked about? So maybe this situation, a silver lining is that the tension that's involved here is something that helps amplify these voices from the public to say, come on, government agencies, come on, companies, you know you can do this better. We know you can do this better. Let's do this better right now.
And so now we have what may not have been conceivable a few months ago or even a few years ago. We have all the world rooting for the end of animal testing, right?
I don't think this would have happened before January 2020. This really is a confluence of a number of different factors that, like you say, the time is right. The access to information about what's going on is right. And people want to see this drug come about. And if you take the time to explain to people how this is moving forward, people tend to be accepting of it. In the case of this drug in particular, the way that this new coronavirus vaccine has been developed, it's not just pulled out of a hat, it's a process that's been used. So especially when talking to people in the field of drug development, immunologists and public health specialists, you can explain how this vaccine works, its structure and its function. And everybody very quickly, 30 seconds of discussion, and they say, oh, I get it. Yeah. Plow, go full steam ahead. And that is something that, is rare. And this absolutely will change how things are done for the rest of our lives.
Right. So skip the animals, spare the animals, get to the science. We can save animals' lives. And if the point is a vaccine, we can save humans' lives too.
You got it.
Right. And, now that the vaccine trial is beginning in Seattle, and they're saying 65 days, phase 1, and then they get more injections, when could a vaccine be available given, just inordinate success from this trial that they're starting in Seattle?
It honestly depends on how those people in this trial live their lives. So let's say that after this very first dose of the vaccine, a group of these people are at a restaurant or something where there's a known person who comes down with coronavirus. If everybody who's received this vaccine, if you can document very quickly that after 2 or 3 weeks, they show no signs of contracting the illness, that moves this forward. So it's very possible that even before this initial small group clinical trial has finished, that maybe this company, maybe the NIH, maybe the FDA will want to expand this trial to include more people. So what we have right now with an outbreak, with this virus spreading on its own, is sort of a natural clinical trial. So if what we see in these early stages of people receiving this experimental vaccine, if they're tolerating it well, it's possible that more people might be eligible to receive it. So that's not a bad thing. That's a great thing. That means that why shouldn't more people be brought into this initial group where even more people are using their own experiences in this natural clinical trial to help prove that this vaccine might work? And the part 2 to that is that this isn't the only clinical trial that's going to be happening. In the next few weeks, in the next few months, dozens of companies are going to be doing very similar things with different versions of these new vaccines against coronavirus. So I think the optimistic message here is that someone will get there first. And who knows? We honestly, because of how unprecedented this situation is, we could be in a situation where in 6 months' time, a government or a company says, we're confident enough in the safety and effectiveness of one of these experimental vaccines that we're going to start offering it to maybe people with immunocompromised immune systems, or people over the age of 65, or any number of groups where the vaccine can actually start being out in the environment. And as quickly as that can happen, even if it's only in small groups of people, that's where you start to see impacts. This is like teaching an immune system in somebody's body how to not be susceptible anymore. And every person in the environment who's not susceptible helps slow down the spread of coronavirus. So this will happen quickly.
And without any animals being tested on, except humans.
Right. I mean, in that range, like I said before, of course, companies and government agencies are doing their own tests on the side while this clinical trial is happening. But you're exactly right. There is no barrier for these tried and true approaches to making vaccines like the one that Moderna is making right now. There's such a good track record for the way that this happens. We know how these vaccines work. There are all sorts of knobs to twiddle, because there are questions about how long does the immunity last if it's a successful vaccine? Does it provide immunity for 6 months or a year or forever? Those are questions that we'll answer in the future. We'll be looking back. But in the short term, the important questions that we're trying to answer are, again, how do we mitigate this health crisis? That's our first priority. And anything that we can do to mitigate it is going to be a good thing. And this clinical trial moving ahead without any animal studies is an excellent step in the right direction.
Jeffrey Brown, thank you for being part of the PETA Podcast.
Thank you so much, Emil.
Jeffrey Brown, a biologics specialist with the PETA Regulatory Testing Department, about the first coronavirus vaccine in the U.S., which skipped animal testing and became one of the fastest ever to human trials. For more, you can go to PETA.org, and to hear about just how historic this is, listen to PETA Podcast number 85, where we talk about how PETA saves millions of lives in the fight to end regulatory animal testing. Listen to the history of it and see how long the fight has been and why this coronavirus test, this vaccine test, the first trial that began this week, is such a significant thing. And once again, go to PETA.org for more. And that's our program. You can contact us at PETA.org. You can find me on Twitter at Emil Amok, that's EMILAMOK, or on ALDEF, that's AALDEF.org/blog. You can read my writing there, or at AMOK.com. Once again, thank you for listening. Check out all our episodes on Apple Podcasts or wherever you do your podcasts. Of course, at Apple Podcasts, you can rate and review the show. It helps get the word out about the issues you care about. Our music is provided by Carbon Works. Check them out on YouTube. And join us again next time for more insights into animal rights and the fight for a cruelty-free world on the PETA Podcast. I'm Emil Guillermo.